The first thing I remember is the warmth. A dense, steady heat seeping through the thin sleeve of my coat, anchoring my head as it lolled sideways. The second was the fabric. Not the cheap, slick polyester of a public transit seat, but something else. A soft, tightly woven wool that smelled faintly of cold night air and something clean, like cedar. I knew, even before I opened my eyes, that I had fallen asleep on a stranger. The knowledge flooded my body not with panic, but with a profound and weary embarrassment that felt heavier than sleep itself. I was on the last train home, a fact that was already a small monument to a day of failures. My freelance work as a paper conservator was less a career and more a collection of precarious moments, and today had been particularly unsteady. A client had refused to pay for 11 hours of meticulous work, claiming the discoloration on a 19th century map was part of its charm I had failed to preserve. I didn't have the energy to argue. I didn't have the money to not argue. The result was this train ride, long past the rush hour crush, in a car rattling with emptiness, where I had succumbed to the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting a battle I had already lost. My eyes cracked open. The first thing I saw was the window, a black mirror reflecting a distorted version of the scene. My own face, pale and smudged with fatigue, was pressed against the dark shoulder of a man. His head was turned away, looking out at the blur of tunnel lights, but the line of his jaw was sharp and clear in the reflection. He was motionless, a statue carved from stillness. I had no idea how long I had been sleeping there, an uninvited wait, a public nuisance. My own wedding had been less intimate. I held my breath, trying to peel myself away without a sound, but the train chose that moment to lurch, jostling me further against him. A small, mortified sound escaped my throat. He didn't flinch. He didn't move a single muscle, but his eyes, dark and unreadable, shifted in the reflection to meet mine. I froze. It was a look that lasted no more than a second, maybe two, but it held a universe of unnerving composure. There was no annoyance, no surprise, no reaction at all. It was the calm of a deep lake, a surface so placid you couldn't guess at its depth or what might lie beneath. I counted. 1, 2, 3 seconds longer than the conversation required. Then his gaze slid back to the window as if he had seen nothing at all. As if I were nothing at all. I finally managed to pull myself upright, my neck screaming in protest. My cheek was hot with shame. I muttered an apology to the side of his head, the words getting caught in the dry cavern of my mouth. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was it. For the next 3 stops, I sat ramrod straight, my hands clenched in my lap, acutely aware of the 6 inches of air between my arm and his. It was the most charged, dense, and textured 6 inches of air I had ever experienced. When the doors hissed open at my stop, I practically fled the train, not daring to look back. I told myself I would forget the entire incident by morning. I knew even as I thought it that I was lying. The feeling of that unnerving stillness, the scent of cedar and cold, had imprinted itself on me. It was a strange, unsettling anchor in the churning sea of my own quiet desperation. 3 weeks passed. The incident on the train faded, not into forgetting, but into the category of strange, isolated city memories that feel like scenes from a film you only half remember. I found a small, new client, a dusty bookstore owner with a box of water-damaged first editions. It was enough to pay my rent, to keep the lights on in my small studio apartment that smelled perpetually of archival glue and old paper. It was a life of smallness, of careful self-protection. I had built it that way after a past that had been too loud, too large, too full of other people's demands. Now, my autonomy was the most precious thing I owned. I answered to no one, and my solitude was a fortress. The day the man arrived, the fortress began to show its cracks. His name, I would learn later, was Mr. Choi. He did not knock. The first thing I heard wasn't the knock. It was the silence before it. The subtle shift in the ambient noise of my apartment building. The hush on the landing outside my door. Then a sound, not a rap of knuckles, but a single, resonant chime from a bell I did not own. I opened the door to a man who seemed to absorb the light in the hallway. He was older, his face a mask of stoic politeness, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a uniform. He held a small, polished silver bell in his gloved hand. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. He was a man who communicated in implication. He looked past me, into my studio, his eyes taking in the scattered tools, the half-finished books, the controlled chaos of my work. His gaze wasn't judgmental, merely assessing. "You are the one who mends things," his silence said. He spoke, his voice a low baritone. "Mr. Jung requests your assistance." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact, a summons. I had no idea who Mr. Jung was. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong person," I said, my hand already moving to close the door. My fortress was under siege. His hand, the one not holding the bell, moved to the doorframe. He didn't push, he just placed it there. A quiet, unmovable obstacle. "There is no mistake," he said, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze was polite, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "He told you that you could take the train." The words landed in the quiet air of the hallway like stones. My breath caught. The train. The stranger. The dark wool coat. The scent of cedar. It wasn't a question. It was a piece of information he was giving me, a key to a lock I hadn't known existed. I stared at him, the carefully constructed walls of my small, manageable life beginning to feel terrifyingly thin. The man on the train, the man who had let me sleep on his shoulder, the man whose stillness had been so profound it had felt like a force of nature. He had sent this emissary. He had remembered me, and for reasons I could not begin to fathom, he was asking for me. Mr. Choi's hand remained on the doorframe, a silent testament to the fact that my day, and perhaps my life, was no longer entirely my own. The car was a black slash of silence in the city's midday clamor. Inside, the noise of the streets vanished, replaced by the soft hum of the engine and the whisper of conditioned air. The carpet absorbed every footstep like a secret. I sat in the back, Mr. Choi in the passenger seat, the driver a nameless, faceless presence behind the tinted partition. I told myself I could have said no. I replayed the scene at my door, trying to find the moment where my choice had been taken from me, but I couldn't. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't forced me. He had simply stated a fact and waited. The truth was, I was propelled by a curiosity so potent it felt like a form of gravity. Who was this man who commanded such quiet, absolute authority? Who remembered a fleeting, anonymous encounter on a train 3 weeks later? We drove for 27 minutes. I counted. The city I knew, the city of bodegas and walk-ups and noisy, crowded streets, fell away. We slid into a part of town that existed only in magazines, a canyon of glass and steel where the buildings scraped the sky. The car eased into a private underground garage, a cavern of polished concrete and silent, expensive vehicles. The elevator was another silent box, ascending without a sound, the numbers climbing at a dizzying pace. My ears popped. Mr. Choi stood beside me, his hands placed behind his back, his posture unchanging. He was a part of the architecture, as solid and unexpressive as the steel around us. The doors opened directly into a room, or rather, a space that was less a room and more a captured piece of the sky. 2 entire walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, revealing a panoramic view of the city so vast and breathtaking it felt unreal. The city below was indifferent, enormous, continuous. The afternoon light, a bruised gold, poured in, illuminating a space of minimalist, almost monastic, emptiness. Dark wood floors, a single long, low sofa, and him. He was standing by the window, his back to me, in a dark shirt and trousers. The room seemed to reorganize itself around his presence. He was the center, the still point around which everything else, the light, the air, the city, was arranged. He turned, and it was him, the man from the train. Older than I had thought by a few years, perhaps late 20s, but his eyes held a much older knowledge. They were the same eyes from the train's reflection, dark and unreadable. He had the same unnerving stillness. He looked at me, and I felt like a single, flawed manuscript laid open for inspection. "You came," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that didn't need to be raised to command the vast space. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, just like Mr. Choi's. I confirmed, the words feeling thin in the air. A small, almost invisible muscle twitched at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the absolute earliest, most theoretical ancestor of a smile, gone before it could be confirmed. An almost smile. I would come to learn the cartography of his face, and this was its most subtle, most frequent landmark. He gestured to a long, flat table that I hadn't noticed, a slab of dark wood against the far wall. On it, laid out on a bed of white silk, was a scroll, or what was left of one. It was ravaged. A large, angry tear ripped through the center, the edges brittle and browned. Water stains bled across the delicate calligraphy, blurring the ink into gray ghosts. It was a scene of devastation. My conservator's heart ached just looking at it. "This is what you do," he stated, his eyes on the ruined object. "You mend things." It was the same phrase Mr. Choi's silence had spoken in my hallway. It was then I understood. This wasn't about the train, not really. The train was just the method of discovery. I was a tool he required, a specific skill set he had sought out. I told myself this was a relief. It made the situation transactional, understandable. I was here to do a job. But as I looked from the broken scroll to his still, watchful face, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that it was far more complicated than that. He was not just a man with a damaged possession. The damage in that room felt older, deeper, and far more complex than a simple tear in a piece of paper. My work has a rhythm, a slow and patient cadence. It is a conversation with the past, a negotiation with damage. I examine, I document, I test. I spend hours looking before I make a single move. This process, my fortress of solitude and precision, was what I brought with me into his world. He gave me a room. It was adjacent to the main living space, another glass box overlooking the city, but this one was filled with the clear, indirect northern light that is a conservator's dream. A custom-built work table had been installed. Every tool I could possibly need, and some I had only dreamed of owning, was laid out in perfect order. Humidifiers, deionisers, precis, watts. My modest studio could have fit into a corner of it. "I am fine," I said. When he showed it to me, the words a reflexive shield against the sheer, disorienting scale of his wealth and preparation. It was the lie I told myself when overwhelmed. He looked at me, his head tilted slightly. The light from the window caught the sharp line of his jaw. He didn't respond to the lie. He simply acknowledged the space between my words and the truth. Every morning, Mr. Choi's silent car would be waiting for me. Every evening, it would take me home. The days settled into a strange routine. I would arrive at 9 a.m. A cup of coffee, brewed to a perfection I could never achieve, would be waiting on my workbench. At 1 p.m., a tray would appear, brought by a quiet, older woman with kind eyes who I came to know only as Mrs. Kim. She never spoke a word to me, but the food was always something warm and nourishing, a quiet signal of care. And he was always there. Jinwoo. His name was Seo Jinwoo. I learned it from a piece of mail left carelessly on a side table, a glimpse into the machinery that ran this silent kingdom. He never worked in the traditional sense. He took meetings in a glass-walled office at the far end of the penthouse, his voice a low, indecipherable murmur. He spent hours on the phone, speaking in a rapid, fluid Korean that sounded like the striking of stones. But mostly he was just present. He would sit on the low sofa in the main room, sometimes for hours, perfectly still, looking out at the city. Or he would stand in the doorway of my workspace, watching me. He never spoke. He never interrupted. He was just a silent, constant pressure at the edge of my awareness. My focus became a shield. I poured all my attention into the scroll. It was a 17th century piece, a poem about a scholar leaving his home for the capital. The paper was mulberry, so fine it was almost translucent. The ink was pine soot, ground by hand. To save it, I had to first understand it. I spent the first week just documenting the damage, taking microscopic photographs, testing the pH of the paper, analyzing the composition of the ink. I was dismantling its history of harm before I could begin to heal it. One afternoon, 7 days into the project, I was hunched over the scroll, examining a particularly fragile section with a magnifying loupe. The air in the room had grown chilly. My fingers were stiff. I hadn't noticed, but he had. I heard a soft click, and the low hum of the climate control system changed its pitch. A gentle wave of warmth washed over the room. I looked up. He was standing across the vast living area, his hand still on a small, sleek control panel on the wall. He was looking not at me, but at the panel, as if he were merely adjusting the weather. But we both knew. His gaze flickered up and met mine for a bare second. It was the same as the train, the same as the first day. A moment of connection so brief and unadorned it felt more significant than an entire conversation. Then he turned and walked back to the window. I went back to my work, but my hands were trembling slightly. It was not from the cold. I told myself it was just efficiency. A comfortable worker is a productive worker. It was a logical, rational explanation. Both of those were true, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that his quiet, pervasive attention was beginning to feel less like surveillance and more like something else. Something I didn't have a name for. It was unsettling. It was also, to my own deep consternation, starting to feel like a strange kind of safety. That night I called Maya. She was my friend from my old life, my anchor to the world outside this glass tower. "So you're basically the beautiful, bookish prisoner in a billionaire's sky castle?" she asked, her voice crackling with the wry humor I missed like a phantom limb. "It's not a sky castle," I said, tracing the condensation on the window of my own small apartment. "And he's not a billionaire. I don't know what he is. Are you okay, Elara? You sound different." "I'm fine," I said, the familiar words tasting like ash in my mouth. But for the first time I heard them for what they were. A wall, and I was no longer sure which side of it I was on. The work was a meditation. I entered the world of the scroll, a world of patient, incremental progress. I learned the cadence of the calligrapher's hand, the unique way he feathered the end of his strokes. I learned the geography of the water damage, the tidal marks left on the paper landscape. The large tear was the main challenge, a violent wound. To fix it, I had to become a weaver, painstakingly aligning the broken fibers of the paper, one by one under a microscope. It was work that required absolute stillness, a slowing of the breath, a steady hand. It was work that mirrored the atmosphere of the penthouse. I began to feel less like an intruder and more like a part of the quiet ecosystem. I learned the way the light changed throughout the day, from the cool, clinical gray of morning to the bruised gold of late afternoon, and finally to the amber intimacy of the evening lamps he would switch on. The city below became a luminous, indifferent sea. The silence, which had at first been a source of tension, acquired a new texture. There was the heavy, weighted silence when he was on a difficult phone call, his back ramrod straight. There was the light, almost airy silence when he would read, turning the pages of a book so quietly I couldn't hear it. And there was the shared silence of the late afternoons, when I would be deep in my work and he would be watching the city, both of us occupied, both of us aware. 11 days of silence, punctuated only by the soft click of my tools and the distant hum of his life. One afternoon my hand slipped. A fine-tipped bamboo pick, slick with paste, shot out of my grip. It was a stupid, clumsy mistake born of fatigue. It flew through the air, heading straight for the most delicate, intact section of the scroll. My heart seized. A gasp was trapped in my throat. Before the tool could land, a hand intercepted it. His hand. He had moved from the doorway, where he had been standing for I don't know how long, with a speed that was utterly silent and shockingly fast. His fingers closed around the small piece of bamboo, inches from the surface of the scroll. I hadn't even seen him move. I was just aware of his presence, a sudden solid wall of warmth beside me. I was still leaning over the table, he was leaning in from the side. Our shoulders brushed. His hand, the one holding the pick, was suspended over the table. My hand was frozen where it had slipped. For a moment we were a tableau. The rescuer, the rescued, the precious object between us. Thank you, I breathed out, the words shaky. He placed the pick carefully on the tray, well away from the scroll. He didn't say you're welcome. He didn't say anything. He just straightened up. But he didn't leave. He stood there, beside my workbench, for 2 seconds longer than the conversation required. I counted. 1, 2. His gaze dropped to my hands, which were resting on the edge of the table. They were stained with pigment and paste, the nails short, the knuckles raw from washing. They were a worker's hands. His eyes lingered on them for a moment, and I felt a sudden, absurd urge to hide them. Then he looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine. Your hands are cold, he stated. It was a simple observation, but it felt like he had read a line from a secret diary. He turned, walked to a small cabinet I had never seen him open, and took out a pair of thin, gray silk gloves. He placed them on the table next to my coffee cup. He didn't tell me to wear them. He just put them there. An offering. An option. Then he retreated to his usual spot by the window, reassuming his post as the silent guardian of the city. I stared at the gloves. They were a contradiction. Silk gloves were for aristocrats, for people who did not work with their hands. And yet, he had offered them as a practical solution to a problem he had observed. Problem I hadn't even voiced. I didn't put them on. My work required direct contact, the sensitivity of bare fingertips. But I didn't move them either. They sat on my workbench for the rest of the day, a small gray testament to his strange, unnerving, and deeply confusing form of care. I told myself it was about protecting his investment. My hands were the instruments he had hired. Of course, he would want them to be in optimal condition. It was a sound and logical reason. It was also a lie. Or at least it was not the entire story. I was beginning to suspect that, with Jinwoo, the logical reason was never the entire story. That night I dreamed of weaving. Not paper fibers, but threads of light, trying to repair a tear in the fabric of the sky. My fingers brushing against a warmth that smelled of cedar and cold air. I woke up with a feeling of profound unease. I was not just restoring his scroll. I was being woven into something myself, something vast and intricate and potentially dangerous. And I was not entirely sure I wanted to find my way out. The first crack in the glass fortress wasn't a sound, but a piece of paper. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of the black car one morning. Mr. Choi plucked it from the glass with a swift, economical motion, his face unreadable. He glanced at it, a flicker of something, annoyance, crossing his features before the mask of stoicism slid back into place. He crumbled it in his gloved hand without showing it to me. But I had seen the single, stark character drawn on it in rough, angry red ink. A character I didn't recognize, but whose meaning was conveyed in the color and the force of the stroke. It was a warning. Everything is in order, Mr. Choi said, his voice as smooth and unruffled as ever, as he opened the car door for me. But the silence in the car on the way to the penthouse that morning was different. It was heavier. It had a new density. I told myself it was none of my business. I was a contractor, a temporary fixture. The politics of this world, whatever they were not my concern. My job was the scroll. And yet I couldn't shake the image of the red character. It felt like a stain that had seeped into the clean, controlled lines of my new reality. When I arrived, Jinwoo was not in his usual place by the window. He was in his glass-walled office on the phone. His back was to me, but I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. His voice was low, but the Korean he spoke was clipped and sharp, each word a piece of flint. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the sound of command under pressure. I tried to focus on my work, but my attention kept snagging on the scene behind the glass. I saw him hang up the phone and stand for a long moment, his hand pressed against the window, looking down at the city. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom that was showing signs of rebellion. A name was spoken in that conversation, a name I would hear again. Kong. It was spat from the other end of the line, a sound like tearing fabric. Later that day, the second crack appeared. I had decided to walk the few blocks from the car drop-off to my apartment, needing the cold evening air to clear my head. The city's noise was a welcome antidote to the penthouse's charged silence. As I rounded the corner to my street, a man walking towards me jostled my shoulder. Hard. It was deliberate. I stumbled, my bag falling from my shoulder, spilling a wallet and a set of keys onto the grimy sidewalk. "Watch where you're going," he snarled, not even breaking his stride. He was just a guy. A random, rude city dweller. That's what I told myself. But there was something in his eyes as he looked back at me, a flicker of cold, deliberate assessment that made my skin crawl. He hadn't been looking at his phone. He hadn't been distracted. He had been looking right at me. I gathered my things, my hands shaking, and hurried to my building. The lobby felt unsafe. The familiar peeling paint and flickering fluorescent light suddenly seemed menacing. When I got inside my apartment, I double-locked the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was nothing. It was a coincidence. The city is full of angry, careless people. I repeated the words like a mantra, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being marked. The next morning, Jinwoo was waiting for me when I stepped out of the elevator. It was the first time he had ever been there to greet me. He was holding a small, steaming cup. "You will work here today," he said. He didn't look at me, his eyes were on the city. Took me a moment to realize what he meant. He was gesturing with the cup towards a small, empty apartment 2 floors below the penthouse, in the same building. "My own studio is fine," I said, my reflexive defense of my autonomy kicking in. "I have my own tools, my own—" "Your tools are here," he interrupted softly. He turned his head and finally looked at me. His eyes were dark, and for the first time, I saw something other than stillness in their depths. It was a flicker of something hard and unyielding, a shadow of the man who spoke in flint-hard Korean on the phone. "The lighting is better for the final stages. Mr. Choi will bring anything else you require." It wasn't a discussion. He was not asking for my opinion. He was reframing my world, redrawing the boundaries, and he was doing it with the quiet, unarguable force of a river rerouting its course around a stone. He was managing me, and the thing that terrified me most was that a part of me, the part that was still trembling from the encounter on the street, was relieved. I followed him down 2 flights of stairs to the new apartment. It was a mirror of my own small studio, but new, clean, and utterly anonymous. And safe. The knowledge hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about the lighting. This was about my safety. He knew. He knew something had happened, or he knew that something was about to. He was moving me, piece by piece, into the heart of his fortress. And he was doing it without ever admitting there was a war outside the walls. The world shrank. It was now the distance between my temporary apartment and the penthouse, a journey of 2 flights of stairs. I told myself it was practical. I was saving time on the commute. My work on the scroll was entering its most delicate phase, and the controlled environment was beneficial. I repeated these logical, sensible reasons to myself until they almost sounded like the truth. But the truth was, I was a willing captive. The invisible perimeter of his protection had tightened around me, and I had walked into it without a word of protest. My old apartment, my old life, felt a million miles away, a life lived by a different person. I didn't even go back for more clothes. Mrs. Kim, the silent housekeeper, had anticipated this. A wardrobe had appeared in the small apartment, filled with simple, elegant clothes in shades of gray, cream, and black. They fit perfectly. I should have been horrified. I should have been outraged at this new level of intrusion, this assumption that my life, my very body, could be so easily accommodated, so seamlessly managed. Part of me was, but another, larger part was simply tired. Tired of the precarity, tired of the vulnerability. There was a strange, seductive peace in being taken care of, even if the care was a form of control. Or maybe it was just that his control felt less like a cage and more like a bulwark against a storm I could feel gathering on the horizon. The rhythm of our days changed. Now, at the end of my workday, I would not descend into the noisy city. I would walk up 2 flights of stairs. Often, he would be there in the main room, and Mrs. Kim would have set out a simple dinner for 2. We ate in silence, mostly, but it was a different kind of silence now. A domestic silence. It was freighted with all the things we were not saying. He never asked about the man on the street. I never told him. He never mentioned the name Kong. I never asked. We orbited the truth, our conversation a series of ellipses. One evening he broke the silence. I was looking at the scroll, which was now almost whole. The tear was a faint, almost invisible seam, the colors of the landscape beginning to re-emerge from the fog of damage. "My grandfather," he said, his voice quiet in the amber-lit room. "He acquired it." He said it was a reminder. I turned from the scroll to look at him. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city. "A reminder of what?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He was quiet for a long time. I thought he wouldn't answer. "That what is broken can be mended," he said, his eyes not on me, but on the scroll. "But that it will always carry the memory of the break." It was the most he had ever said to me. It was a piece of himself, offered up as simply and directly as the silk gloves, as the cup of coffee. It was a key. I felt a click, a tumbler falling into place inside me. This wasn't just a job. The scroll wasn't just an object. It was a symbol, a proxy for something else, something larger, something broken within his own world, his own history. And I was the one he had chosen to mend it. The next day, a woman came to the penthouse. She was tall, elegant, with eyes that saw everything. She was an art dealer, a name I recognized from auction catalogs. She was there to see Jin-woo, but her eyes landed on me as I worked. She came over, her heels silent on the dark wood floor. "Ah," she said, her voice like old velvet. "The restorer." She looked at my work, her gaze sharp and appreciative. "He has a good eye." Then she looked at me, a real, searching look. "He chooses his objects very carefully, you know. He sees the value beneath the damage." She smiled. A knowing, conspiratorial smile. "Be careful. Sometimes he wants to keep what he has restored." She walked away, leaving me with my heart beating a little faster. It was a warning, but it was also a confirmation. I was not imagining it. The tension, the unspoken current between us, was real. Someone else could see it. That night, the storm broke. I was working late, trying to finish the final delicate process of toning the repair so it would be invisible. The penthouse was silent. Jin-woo was out. Mr. Choi had driven him to a meeting. I was alone, for the first time in weeks. At 11:17 p.m., the power went out. Not just in the penthouse, but the entire building. The sudden, absolute darkness was disorienting. The city lights outside vanished. The hum of the building died. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was predatory. And then I heard it. A sound from the main entrance. The soft, metallic click of a lock being picked. Someone was coming in. My blood ran cold. This was it. The threat was no longer a piece of paper or a man on the street. It was here. It was at the door. My first instinct was to run, to hide. But where? The apartment was a glass box, offering no cover. The service stairs were my only way out, but the door was on the far side of the room, past the entrance. My mind raced, a frantic search for options in the suffocating darkness. The scroll. My gaze, useless in the dark, darted toward my workbench. The scroll was the target. I knew it with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. It wasn't just a piece of art. It was a symbol of legitimacy, of power. The dealer's words echoed in my head. He chooses his objects very carefully. Kong didn't just want to threaten Jin-woo. He wanted to take something from him, to humiliate him by stealing a piece of his history. The lock clicked again, a final, decisive sound. The door began to swing open. There was no time. I couldn't save myself, but maybe I could save it. Acting on pure, unthinking instinct, I scrambled to the workbench. My hands, which knew the space so intimately, found the long, flat case where I stored the scroll at night. It was heavy, awkward. I fumbled with it, my fingers clumsy with fear. I could hear soft footsteps entering the room, more than one person. Whispers in Korean, sharp and low. I held my breath, pressing myself into the shadows beneath the workbench. It was a child's hiding place, foolish and obvious. They would find me in seconds. I needed a distraction, something to draw them away from this corner of the room. My eyes fell on the heavy steel press I used for flattening paper. It was on the far side of the studio area, near the windows. It was a desperate, stupid plan. I clutched the scroll case to my chest, my knuckles white. I could hear them moving through the living area, the soft scuff of their shoes on the wood floors. They were using small flashlights, the beams cutting jagged paths through the darkness. One of the beams swept across the floor, perilously close to my hiding spot. I had to do it now. Taking a deep breath, I shoved the scroll case as far under the workbench as it would go. Then, I took one of my heaviest tools, a solid agate burnisher, and hurled it with all my might towards the steel press. It hit with a loud, metallic clang that shattered the silence. The flashlight beams immediately snapped in that direction. "What was that?" one of the voices hissed. It worked. For a second, they moved towards the noise, away from me. This was my chance. I had to get out. But as I started to creep out from under the table, one of the flashlight beams swung back, catching me in its glare. I froze, like a deer in the headlights. A man stood there, a dark shape against the window. He took a step towards me, and then the world erupted. The main door, the one the intruders had so carefully picked, crashed open, torn from its hinges. The sound was like a thunderclap. Figures in black moved through the doorway, silent and swift. Mr. Choi was at their head, a specter of brutal efficiency. The fight was short, violent, and almost completely silent. It was a blur of motion, of dark shapes colliding, the sickening thud of fists on flesh. It was nothing like the movies. It was a craft, a trade, executed with chilling precision. I was still huddled on the floor, my mind unable to process the sudden shift from terrifying silence to swift, controlled violence. And then he was there. Jinwoo. He hadn't come through the door with the others. He had come from somewhere else, from within the building. He appeared in the doorway of the studio as if materialized from the shadows. He wasn't armed, not in any way I could see. He didn't need to be. His presence was the weapon. The room, which had been a whirlwind of motion, seemed to slow down, to hold its breath. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with that same unnerving calm. He saw the intruders being subdued by his men. He saw Mr. Choi checking the perimeter. And then his eyes found me, still on the floor, the flashlight lying next to me, casting a pool of theatrical light. He walked towards me, his footsteps the only sound in the now silent room. He didn't rush. He moved with the same deliberate, unhurried grace as always. He stopped in front of me. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. He was checking for damage. I realized with a jolt that I was an object in this room, just like the scroll, something precious he needed to assess for harm. And in that moment, something in me snapped. The fear, the gratitude, the confusion. It all coalesced into a single, hot point of anger. I had been threatened, terrified, and I had acted to protect his property, his history. I had saved the scroll. But I was not a scroll. I was not an object. I was a person, and I had been pulled into the heart of his secret, violent world without my consent. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky but my resolve solidifying. I met his gaze, and for the first time I didn't look away. For the first time I wasn't intimidated by his stillness. I was furious with it. The adrenaline was a roaring fire in my veins. "I will not be managed," I said. The words came out low and trembling, but they filled the space between us. The silence in the room was absolute now. His men were ghosts at the periphery, their work done. Mr. Choi stood like a statue by the ruined door. But they were not there. There was only him and me in the wreckage. Jinwoo's face was unreadable, a mask of shadows and faint light from the single dropped flashlight. He didn't react. He just watched me, his stillness a wall I was determined to break through. "I am not a possession," I continued, my voice gaining strength. I am not one of your objects to be chosen, protected, and kept in a secure location. I gestured wildly at the room, at the view, at the invisible cage of his care. I am not the scroll. I will not be handled. The last word was a hiss. I was breathing hard, my body vibrating with a terror and fury so profound it felt like it might tear me apart. I had laid all my cards on the table. My autonomy, the one thing I had cherished and protected, felt like it had been systematically dismantled, and I was finally fighting to reclaim it. He was silent for a long moment. I could feel the weight of his unasked questions, the pressure of his unspoken thoughts. I expected him to be angry, to be dismissive. I expected him to turn and walk away. He did none of those things. He took one step closer. The space between us shrank to inches. "You are not," he said. His voice a low, quiet rumble that cut through my anger. It was a simple, declarative statement. An agreement. My tirade seemed to falter, the air leaking out of my righteous fury. That wasn't the response I had prepared for. He looked at me, and for the first time the mask slipped. Not much, just a fraction. But I saw it. In the slight furrow of his brow, in the way his jaw tightened for a second. I saw the cost of the night written on his face. "It was not my intention to frighten you," he said. "It was my intention to keep you safe. There's a difference?" I shot back, the anger still simmering. "Between being safe and being a prisoner?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "One is a cage. The other is a choice." He held my gaze, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. He was giving me back the one thing I thought he had taken. The choice. "I knew they would come for the scroll," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did not know they would be so foolish as to come when you were here. That was my mistake, my second mistake, though I didn't know it yet." The line from my own thoughts, my own retrospective narration, echoed in his admission. He was admitting a flaw in his perfect, controlled world. He was admitting fallibility. He was admitting he had put me in danger. It was an apology, wrapped in the language of strategic failure. I saw it then. The contained stillness, the economy of words, the obsessive control. It wasn't just about power. It was about protection. Not just of objects, but of a world, a family, a legacy that was constantly under siege. And he had, unwittingly or not, included me within that perimeter. My anger began to recede, replaced by a vast, aching exhaustion. I looked at him, at this man who was a walking contradiction,